Hello, welcome everyone to our roundtable discussion today. My name is Norma Rantisi, and I'm a professor in the Department of Geography, Planning, and Environment at Concordia University. And before officially formally introducing our roundtable presentations, I would like to actually acknowledge that Concordia University, although I'm not physically situated there, which is virtually hosting this conference, and Montreal, where I am situated, is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanakahake Nation is recognized as the custodian of these lands and waters on which we gather today. Zurich, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples in the Montreal community. Okay, and now I would like to just introduce our roundtable. Actually, there'll be several of us who are co-editors of the book that we'll be discussing today, in which we have a number of contributors that will present. And the name of the book is Marketplace: Exploring Spaces of Exchange. And the objective of the book is to advance a pluralist research program on the critical study of markets and marketization, one that could offer an alternative to neoclassical conceptions of the market, by offering an alternative that posits markets in their diverse and concrete small m markets, pluralized form. So the book seeks to reclaim the terrain of the market for heterodox, substantive, critical inquiry, and elucidate the ways in which the instituted, hybrid, networked, and contested character of markets, by foregrounding markets as variegated constructs that are always in the making. Such a project seeks to break with an essentialist conception, as well as with critical heterodox accounts that present the market as hegemonic or uniform force. So we actually have 4 panelists today who will be providing brief commentaries on their respective chapters in the edited collection, Marketplace, which was edited by Christian Berndt, Jamie Peck, and myself. And they will talk about how their contributions contribute to the pluralist project of placing markets and marketization. But before passing it on to those presenters, there'll be a brief introduction, and I'll actually introduce the order of the speakers now. The brief introduction by co-editors Christian Berndt and Jamie Peck. Christian Berndt is a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Zurich. Jamie Peck is professor of geography in the University of British Columbia, and also a global professorial fellow at Western Sydney University. And after some brief introductory remarks by my co-editors of the book, we will have presentations by Erika Schoenberger, who's a professor in the Department of Environmental Health and Health Engineering at Johns Hopkins University, Mark Harvey, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at University of Essex, Dan Cohen, Professor in the Department of Geography and Planning at Queen's University, and Philip Ashton, a professor in the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And we will be saving the questions for the very end. So now I would like to turn it over to the co-editor, Christian Berndt.
Okay, thank you very much, Norma, and I hope you can hear me. Following on from what Norma said, the book for us is just a space of encounter and a platform for discussion that connects with 2 interlinked developments. On the one hand, the ongoing revival of Polanyian thinking across the social sciences, and on the other hand, the emergence of what can be called critical market studies. And this is maybe in a very stylized way, but there are 2 different directions in which the contributors to the book approach Polanyi and markets. There's a more political economy inspired view and one that is more closely connected with cultural economy. But even if individual voices differ here, all contributions are written in a spirit of constructive dialogue. And I think that Jamie will say more about the former position, political economy, perhaps more closely connected with Polanyi. And I would like to use my time to shed some light into the cultural economy take on markets. It's actually also outlined in my own contribution together with Mark Böckler to the book. And this position is not so much about Polanyi, the political economist, where market forces destroy social bonds and nature, nor is it about the socio-economic Polanyi, if you want, stressing the societal embeddedness of market and economy. The cultural economy position is a bit different, and I would like to make 4 key points, but I think, and you will see this, there are obviously ways to connect with Karl Polanyi. The first point, markets are performed, or to put it with Michel Calon, economy is embedded not in society, but in economics. This is an often misunderstood sentence. It just means that economic knowledge in different shapes, theories, models, scripts, performs actually existing markets. And this is not so far away from what Polanyi may have had in mind in the Great Transformation when he pointed out, and I quote him here, it's also often quoted, instead of economy being embedded in social relations are embedded in the economic system. And there are many different kinds of market templates around. Of course, the neoclassical perfect market plays an outsized role, but there are different scripts. So for instance, the market is chain, driven by supply chain management logistics, or the moral market performed by behavioral and experimental economics, or by the proponents of market design, or even the market as digital platform. And there may be many more. And these templates work on markets. They create the conditions of possibility for marketization. Second point, markets are institutionally diverse. Actually, existing markets are always enacted at the crossroads of multiple logics and rationalities, and these may be economic or more non-economic. And here, Polanyi's ideal institutional reforms are actually nicely connected, redistributing hierarchies, reciprocal communities, autonomous households, and so on. The third point, seeing marketization as a process, not looking at market as a stable entity. If we acknowledge the processual character of economic entities, this allows us to be open for incompleteness, for instability and friction. Nothing can be marketized and commodified all the way down, connecting, of course, to Polanyi's double movement. And the fourth point, marketization as struggle around social boundaries and spatial borders. Marketization works around clear ideas of what belongs to the market and what is actually outside. And as a particular way of economic world making, it is structured by hierarchies of race, class, and gender, and other dimensions of social difference. So marketization operates on deeply uneven socio-spatial terrain, and therefore, rather than overcoming, it actually reinscribes social difference and spatial borders, both within, between, and across jurisdictions. And I think that's actually all from my side. I would like to leave it here. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to the discussion. I'm handing over to Jamie.
Thanks a lot, Christian. I'll carry this forward on behalf of the 3 editors, where we just wanted to sketch some of these broader themes that shape the book, and the workshop that took place actually at the Polanyi Institute in the days when such things happened, where we were really meeting to some extent on the terrain of Polanyian scholarship, even as some of the contributors to the workshop and the book wouldn't consider themselves to be entirely working in that tradition. What they shared, as Christian mentioned, was a constructive relationship with Polanyian scholarship and the questions that it raises. And one of the things that the book does is to pick up what we saw as editors as some of the unfinished business and open questions in the wake of Polanyi's treatment of markets. Of course, Polanyi is well known for his polemics against the market and his discussion of the consequences of implying the, quote, market shape of things and imposing that on other economic forms, or using it as a standard against which to judge other economic forms and dynamics. Yet one of the ironies is that Polanyi arguably had more to say about the markets others than he did about the historical geographies of actually existing markets and how they might be classified, analysed, and so on in their complex concrete forms. We could also acknowledge that the metaphor of embeddedness, while useful, prompt, and to some extent heuristic, can only take us so far. It's been demonstrated, for example, that the metaphor of embeddedness tends to reproduce the ontological separation that it sets out to challenge, along with the implication that markets are more kinetic and generalized, while the implicitly more static social bed is more rooted and place specific. And if markets are, as Fred Bloch and others have argued, always and everywhere embedded, we return in a sort of circular way to the question of how to specify, classify, and analyze the actually existing variety of market forms. We might be invited to index that variety to extra market factors, which once again allows the market to sort of slip through and be the tacit universal, which is rendered different only through its interactions with extra market forms and forces. So it's this sort of puzzle, really, of how to engage with the revealed differentiation and spatiality of markets that was one of the animating questions for the book. And for all his suggestive work on the mapping of socioeconomic diversity, Polanyi's research program on actually existing markets was itself somewhat truncated. Towards the end of his life, he launched a interdisciplinary program under the banner of comparative economy, which arguably opened up the potential for analysing the market alongside other socio-economic formations, rather than in the shadow of them, rather than analysing those in the shadow of markets. But in many ways, that work was only partly completed. So for the card-carrying Polanyian and for the Polanyi-adjacent scholar, in many respects, there's still work to do around the diversity and transformations in actually existing markets. And this is what we hoped that the collection that we draw together in this agenda book will begin to do, and which some of the other contributors to the book will now speak to. So I'll hand over now to the first presenter.
Thanks. That would be Erica.
That would be me. I'm going to share my screen. Thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a good book. It's a good group of people. I just dropped something important on the floor, and I'm really happy to be here. So I am going to talk about where markets come from. And I want to do that because I want to understand better where capitalism comes from. And I'm going to set the discussion further back in history than is usually the case. So I'm looking at Europe Western Europe, Northwestern Europe from about the 8th century to the mid 14th century. I'm going to end up in England, but I'm going to go by way of ancient Greece and ancient Rome and Francia. So it will be very scenic. But the argument that I want to end up on is this, that it was the needs of the ruling classes of early medieval Europe that led to the formation of cities and markets and monetized markets in particular. And those needs arose from the problems of acquiring and maintaining power. Fighting wars in particular, this was a heavily militarized era of social life. Managing resources across space, which is not so easy when you're doing ox carts, and competing with each other. And so the solution to these problems that they had in doing all of these things to a significant extent was money. And the payoff on money is that money gives you liquidity. It allows the transformation of immobilized or scattered or very bulky resources into liquid assets that can flow across territory and can be manipulated through time and space. And this is what you need in order to fight these wars and to compete against the other ruling classes of your era. So money, where does money come from? Money comes from markets, and markets are located in towns. And so the ruling class needed markets and towns and money in a way that other people in their societies did not. And so they created those things. They created the towns and the markets and the money to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. So, oops. Is that right? Yes, okay, yeah. So we know a lot of things about where capitalism came from or what capitalism needed to come into being. We know it needed a free wage labor force, and we know a lot about how that came about. So I'm not even gonna talk about it, also because it's later than my period. We know they needed money, markets, cities, and so I've already hinted at what I'm gonna say about them. And then we also know that they needed capitalists, and I'm not sure that anybody much has tried to figure out where the sort of people who become capitalists and who have the assets to become capitalists, the resources, come from. And so part of this project is to try and figure out how you create capitalists. Okay, so the standard story about all of these things is that it all starts with the human propensity to exchange. And in the beginning, we barter with each other, lollipop for Hershey bar. And we all know that, and this is a standard story, by the way, that dates from Aristotle, runs through Marx, and up to the present day in your standard economics class. So barter is recognized as being exceptionally clumsy. You have a hard time figuring out how to exchange a pound of butter for a shirt. What is each worth? What if the person with the butter doesn't want a shirt and the person with the shirt doesn't want butter? So there's a coincidence of needs problem. And it just all gets incredibly complicated, and you have 15 different side deals going on. And so it's obviously a problem. And this is a problem that money solves. And that's why we have money, to lubricate the whole process of exchange and to crystallize the qualities of butter and shirt into quantities that can then be exchanged. You don't have to know the person you're dealing with. You don't have to exchange this thing for that thing exactly. You can, you guys know. I'm sorry to have gone on so much about it. Okay, and so markets and towns emerge as generations of anonymous people come together in pursuit of their own individual interests, and they fetch up in some well-located place, and they start exchanging with each other, and money helps them a lot, and markets and towns just emerge, right, out of the mists of time, because it's faceless, nameless people who are doing these things. And because of their actions, markets and towns emerge. So I think that the standard story is wrong about barter. I think that it's wrong about money. I think it's wrong on why markets and towns come into being. So to take barter first, actually, if you think about how most people throughout history have lived, barter is not a big deal problem because most people have been living in the same place for generations. They know what things are worth. The value of the butter in the shirt is something that, as Alfred Marshall said, you breathe in with the air. And importantly, you know, if Adam Smith thought that the virtue of the market is that it disciplined the businessman, so as not, you know, so you can't allow, he won't be allowed to cheat or, you know, market shoddy goods. In the kind of communities that I'm talking about, which are small, very place-based, and as I say, there for generations, it's the discipline of the community that keeps everybody in line. And so you don't need a market for discipline. You don't need a market to set prices. And you actually don't need a market to clear at the end of the day because people can run tabs with one another. So, you know, Edwina the peasant gives Roderick, the woodcutter, a piglet in the spring, and he promises to give her wood for the winter and the fall. And lo and behold, he does. And he throws in a carved wooden spoon because he knows, and Edwina knows, and the entire community know that the spoon is necessary to make the transaction come out right. So no haggling is needed, no thinking about it. And indeed, if you make these people go to town and do their marketing, it's actually probably less efficient than their barter arrangements because you have to schlep into town on your donkey if you happen to have one, and you have to, you know, figure out what you want to do and how much to pay and all this kind of stuff. So in certain circumstances, which do characterize much of human history, barter is actually probably more efficient than the standard notion of what a market is. Anyway, if you don't believe me, I will quote Polanyi. He says, trade and money originate separately and independently from markets. They do not arise, as has been thought, from individual barter and exchange. So where does money come from? In 3000 BC in Babylonia, accounts were kept in shekels. They didn't exist physically. They were monies of account because the whole produce of the city came into the temples and the palace and was then redistributed from there. So you didn't need money to buy things with. You just needed some unit of account to keep track of how many gurs of barley and lambs and you know, figs were coming through, and you know, who they came from in the form of taxes and who they went to in the form of redistribution. And so the earliest money was not, in fact, money meant for lubricating exchange. Now, early coins came from Lydia in Western Anatolia in the 7th century BC. This is where we find the first gold coins. They are coins, they are stamped. You can see one in the corner there. They're, you know, you can see that it's not very coin-like in its shape. And in fact, they are not meant to be money. They are meant, what you see impressed upon them is the personal seal of some immensely powerful man. And he prints these things in order to show how powerful he is. And he gives them away as gifts in order to bind people to him in complex gift relationships, with which he makes alliances and amplifies his own power. And this is a kind of politics in ancient Greece where we now go in the 6th century when gold coinage started being produced in Greece. That continues there. You give each other gold objects, and among those objects are these gold coins, and they are not used as money. And it's a politics that's set in the countryside, just big men, you know, big men who are dealing with one another and deciding how the world is going to be run. when Athens tries to remove political power from the hands of these guys and bring it into the polis, it also starts issuing coinage, and it does so as a way of countering the power of those guys, and also not to lubricate exchange, because in fact, everybody there, and this is true of the Romans as well, who I will get to, think that commerce is really reprehensible. It's morally despisable. You, according to Aristotle, you should only engage in commerce to provide things that you absolutely need and that you can't provide for yourself. And so nobody's minting these coins in order to foster trade. And nevertheless, trade begins to happen. And I'm going to argue both in the case of Greece and in the case of Rome that this has to do with different forms of warfare and different geopolitical strategies. So we're talking about Greeks in the 5th century, Peloponnesian War, Rome and the Principate. These places both have imperialist projects, which mean covering a lot of territory. And they are also undergoing a drastic transformation in the way that wars were fought. So in both cases, the original warrior was a farmer warrior. He armored himself. You would go out on campaign in the summer, generally for one pitched battle, and you would burn and loot if you won. And then everybody would return home and start farming again. But that's not how you become an imperial power. And in the case of Athens, what they needed, given their geographical situation, was a navy, a standing navy, which was new, okay? And they have like 200 triremes they build with 40,000 rowers. And these are not people who can go home to harvest the olives at the end of the campaigning season. These are people who need to be permanently supported. Building the ships is an enormous task. The oarsmen have to be meticulously trained to do the maneuvers of warfare. And you can only do this with money.
Eric, you have 3 minutes left.
Oh, darn. Okay. My, how time flies. We're just going to skip right through this. Just take my word for it. Armies create markets. Markets grow up around armies. You would have seen it in Charlemagne if I was not so gabby. Here's Alfred the Great. If anybody's watching The Last Kingdom, you will recognize him. And let me just zip through Alfred. He's fighting the Danes. He's reconquering all old Roman towns. He takes Winchester and rebuilds the town within the old Roman walls. He lays down 5 miles of cobblestone street in Winchester. It's his capital. So that's like 8,000 tons of cobblestones. So massive resources are being put into rebuilding these old cities. When he came to power in 871, there were basically about 10 towns in Britain at the time. And you must understand that the collapse after the fall of the Roman Empire was so drastic that the Britons lost the capability to make ceramics. Okay, so they were just in nowhere. 880, 10 towns. By 930, probably 50 towns. By 1066, probably 100 towns. And so the question is, where do they come from? And partly they come from the fortified places that Alfred made all over Wessex. Some of them are just small forts, but most of them are actually small towns, which house a garrison, which has to be maintained, and where people can come and hide themselves when the Danes come. But these are also laid out as planned units with gridded streets, and they are supported by taxes from the countryside. And again, you can do a lot with renders in kind, but the renders are very specific. You can't just increase them arbitrarily. And the time of service is also very specific. So in England, the knight's service was basically 40 days. And if you needed him beyond 40 days, you had to pay him. Not to mention mercenaries, who of course you also have to pay. So this is where the need for money comes from. we're talking about a completely militarized society. They're at war all the time, so this is always going on. And we're talking about a massive resource mobilization over space. Here's a map of Winchester. So we're talking about massive mobilization of resources in place. So this is the grid that he laid out and rebuilt the Roman walls. Here is Stratford upon Avon, which was founded by a bishop at the end of the 12th century. And what I want to draw your attention to is all those little rectangles. So the bishop picks the spot, lays out the town, and plats it into all these little rectangles. And many of these become what are known as burgages. They are kind of free-held properties that owe a kind of ground rent to the Lord, but are otherwise, you can sell them, you can subdivide them, you can rent them out so that you get more money coming in rent than you are paying to the Lord in ground rent. And those burgages are held by burgesses who become a kind of town patriciate. They get more and more control over their own political existence. They become rich. The rest of the people in the town are basically serving them. And so we have the rise of a group of people who are not yet capitalists, but who have all the resources that you need to become capitalists. And they have those resources because the social and physical infrastructure for capitalism has been laid down by the feudal aristocracy, which I find delicious and unexpected. And so, obviously they didn't intend to do that, but they did. And one of the side effects of that is that it turns out that feudalism, which we always think of as rural, is inherently urban. And it's urban because of the needs of the ruling class that has created the system. So, so that's it. Wars demand liquidity in a way that no other human endeavor does. This is where coined money comes into its own. Wars also produce opportunities for profit that are hard to match. And this is also where markets come from. And so I think that Standard Story has it wrong. It's not that exchange creates markets and towns and the need for money. It's the other way around, that the ruling class has a need for money, so they create markets and they create towns. Almost all of those 1,000 towns that existed by 1066 were in fact built by the ruling class, including developing the properties and finding people to live in them and work in them. So that's my pitch, and I hope Polanyi would like it. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. And now we will turn to Mark Harvey.
Hello, it's very good to be here, and also I'm very grateful to the to Norma and Christian and Jamie for having organised the whole of the book and the discussions that have come out of it. So I'm going to share my screen. So the chapter is called Of Water and Knowledge, and it looks at the formation and scaling of public goods and markets. And in a way, it doesn't follow exactly from what Erica's just been talking about, but it does really emphasize the absolutely essential framing of markets within a wider space of state and public economies. I take my inspiration from late Polanyi and his idea of instituted economic process and his Columbia lectures, where he is really, I think, calling upon us to abandon a lot of disciplinary boundaries in order to create an idea of a comparative and general economic history. And my contribution to that really sort of takes that very kind of seminal idea into an idea of instituted economic process. Polanyi had two processes. One was exchange and the other one was distribution. And I'm adding what we have now call in contemporary societies production and consumption. And I look at configurations of production, exchange, consumption, and distribution, whether for public goods or for market goods or for anything that's neither one really or the other. And as you can see, I look upon this as something which is continuously changing, hybridizing, a lot of heterogeneity in both time and space. And the idea of instituted for me is essentially that it problematizes both temporal and spatial scale of any economic organization. And in my chapter, I'm looking at drinking water and knowledge, partly because in their very different ways, I think we probably always agree, we could all agree that both drinking water and knowledge are pretty well very important for any possible and imaginable society and economic organization. And I'm just going to give you an idea of how I look at this by looking at a taster from each of these two fields from research that I did, which was also comparative and historical. And I'm just going to give you a taster from this. The drinking water was comparing European countries and then capital cities of Mexico, Delhi and London. And so this was field work I did in Taiwan. Taiwan is an interesting form of economic organization where the kind of conflicts between the public and market are very evident, and shifting scales between them are very important. So this is what is this peculiar instituted market of a drinking water garage. And in this, you can go and buy your drinking water, and there are 5 different qualities, each of them at different prices of drinking water. That's irrespective of the fact that there is uniquely a state public water provision, which is potable water, more or less across the whole of the island and at a uniform price. So you have in a way, a very strong public water provisioning system. The Taiwanese, however, culturally do not drink water straight from a tap at all, ever. I think more or less they always boil it, however they then drink it. So when Taiwanese students come to the universities here, they find it impossible to pour a glass of water and drink it straight from a tap. It would be a kind of cultural outrage to do so. So this is a very unique kind of institution, and it is distinctly hybrid because the source of the water for these water garages is the public water distribution system, and the private company pays the public sector the public price, the uniform national public price for every litre of water that it then processes and sells. So this is a very distinctive sort of hybridized form of which is a mixture, a blend, and hybridization of the public and private. And in a way, this is the whole purpose of doing this kind of research, is to problematize what is public and why and how it emerges. And in this particular case, this is in the southeast of Taiwan. There is a deep distrust of the public water supply. The infrastructure is dilapidated and untrustworthy, and this has given permission, or given the kind of stimulus for this kind of hybridized private system of the drinking water garage. So that gives you a taste of what a kind of instance of how there is this tension and conflict between the public and the market exchange or economic organization. So turning now to knowledge, this is again just as it were a taster. I'm looking here at a very important bacterium called Agrobacterium tumefaciens. it was an extreme scientific interest as a pathogen which has the ability to create a kind of cancerous growth in plants. So there was a kind of a very significant scientific interest in it as a kind of a very distinctive kind of pathogen. But it was equally of incredible commercial interest because it was the tool with which Monsanto and DuPont brought about the genetic modification of plants. So it had a huge amount of commercial interest. And there was a race between two groups of both public-private combinations. One was the University of Washington, Seattle and DuPont in a kind of collaboration, and the other one was Monsanto and Hiram College. And they both knew that they were both of them trying to get to the end goal of the full genomic sequence of this bacterium. And eventually DuPont pulled out. The National Science Foundation then pushed University of Washington to complete the genome, but did so on condition of it going public. And then the race kind of stopped and started and accelerated and then finally ended in what was an almost unique example of a dead heat. So both in the end were forced, University of Washington effectively forced Monsanto to deposit its genome on the public genome database at the same time, more or less, as Washington University did. And then they negotiated with the journal Science to both of them produce an article which published their identical genomes in the same issue of the journal, public journal Science. So what's significant about this, again, is that you have a very different but interesting kind of hybridization of public knowledge and private knowledge, because it's equally absolutely clear that both Monsanto and DuPont retained behind their firewalls as a private but non-market good their own distinctive genomic knowledge around this bacterium, at the same time as supporting and in the event publishing in the public domain and the public databases a full genomic sequence of the bacterium. And Monsanto clearly understood that they benefited enormously from there being a public version of the genome, which was continuously being improved, worked on, compared with other bacteria and so on within public science. So there was a codependency of Monsanto's own internal private knowledge with the development of public knowledge. And I think, there are two things which are quite sort of important about this. In developing these global genomic databases, in a way, a new public domain was created, and scientists had to agree to a set of new norms about how they behaved and regulated this new public domain of databases. So in a way, it was the creation of a public good was at the same time the creation of a new public in terms of a global public of norm-following scientists of a particular kind. So you have this co-constitution of a public and a public and a public domain. And I think looking at the present circumstances of the vaccine and the virus, you can see. I mean, it would be such a rich area to develop this exactly this kind of analysis, where you see a huge variation from one nation to another as to exactly what the tensions and conflicts there are between AstraZeneca and the EU, or how the different public and private domains in terms of national provision and distribution of the vaccine is concerned. You could do exactly this kind of analysis in terms of these conflicts and tensions between the public and the private domain. So that's essentially the kind of real purpose of undertaking this kind of research. It looks at it historically and comparatively, and essentially is always thinking about multimodalities. So it problematizes the space of the market by placing it within the broader framework of public goods and state regulation and so on. So you see hybrids and interdependent market and public spaces. They're shifting scale. So, for example, the creation under dictatorship of in Taiwan of a national public water system was a particular creation of a new scale. You can find scale frictions, local, national, and international.
Mark, you have 3 minutes.
Yeah, I'm just about to finish, so I'll keep to that. And you see, in a way, a co-constitution of publics and public goods on the one hand, and then a constitution or an institution of consumer social divisions between high value, high price markets and the economy, the discount stores and so on, with structured markets. So to end, I say that it's Polanyi inspired, and the work is really a call for looking at general economic histories in a comparative way versus abstract models, and it's looking to develop a comparative and a historical knowledge discipline. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And now we will turn to Dan Cohen. Oh, Mark, can you?
Yeah, you moved, yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry.
Great, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to Norma, Christian, Jamie for organizing this session as well as the book. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people here in Kingston, Canada. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm present on their lands as an uninvited guest. I'm going to present here my chapter, Markets as Struggle, the Circulation, Construction, and Contestation of Charter School Markets in the United States. And I'm going to try to focus on two of the themes of the book, thinking about markets as instituted spaces, as well as thinking about markets as contested spaces, and really the relationship of instituted spaces with contestation, or as I called in the title, struggle in markets. And so I'm going to do that in three steps. I'll give you a brief overview of my topic and the approach I took to it. Look a little bit into two case studies in Michigan and Oregon of charter school markets, and then end with a few takeaways. So what are charter schools? What are charter school markets? Well, basically they're a policy intervention that's designed explicitly to create market forces within publicly funded K-12 or primary and secondary education within the US. And these have been hugely popular in that country, supported financially from some of the richest people in the world, from Bill Gates to the Walton family of Walmart fame. And what they essentially try to do is create markets within public systems of education by positioning students as consumers that shop for a school. So many of you probably went to school in this system where you went to your local school. You might have gone to a specialty school, but largely where you went to school was determined by the school district you attended or where you lived. This switches that, so students have a variety of options where they can go to school, and they're really explicitly positioned as kind of keen shoppers, or them and their parents are positioned as shoppers for their schools. On the other hand, schools can now are opened up to private actors. These can be nonprofit or in some cases for-profit, who are allowed to receive students who are public school students, and then they get money for each student that attends their school. And this really puts in place a competitive pressure where these schools need to compete for students in order to receive funding. What's key here is that these markets really vary widely according to different states and even local regulatory frameworks. So what's common is that schools, if they want to enter this market, have to be approved by an authorizer. So that's often a state agency, but the level of regulation of these schools and what constitutes an authorizer really can vary dramatically. And what's key to this presentation and what I want to talk about is that these markets have really created a highly uneven geography across the United States. So in some states, you have over 10% of students attending charter schools, going as high as 17% in Arizona. And in other states, 6 states, there's less than 1% of students attending charter schools. And so the question I want to focus on here is what accounts for this variegation within this common policy environment where there's actually a lot of pressure and a lot of money behind adopting charter schools as a system and really adopting a kind of unregulated view of charter school laws. And so in approaching this question, and in my contribution to the book is focusing on how markets function as both instituted spaces and contested spaces. And what underlied this approach is an understanding of markets as not predictable sites, but rather that struggles over their form can shape how they operate, so that they can shape the institutions that govern market exchange, but that these struggles differ spatially according to the politics of particular places and the spatial connection between markets and other circuits of power. And I'll spend a bit of time discussing exactly what this means and how it manifests in 2 different sites, which are my case studies. So what I did in this project was compare 2 states which have very different profiles in terms of how their markets operate, Michigan and Oregon. In Michigan, 9.9% of the state's students attend charter schools. And what's really different about Michigan is that 80% of these schools are for-profit operators who often run chains of multiple schools. And the other thing we see that's distinct about Michigan compared to Oregon is that there's a large concentration of charter schools in major urban areas, going up to 46% of Detroit students attending charters. In Oregon, we see a kind of a smaller market where 5.9% of state enrollment are students attending charter schools. And rather than seeing for-profit operators running multiple charter schools in a chain, here we see mostly single school operators, one-off schools, largely run by nonprofits. And rather than seeing an urban focus within Oregon, there's a large number of students attending online or virtual charter schools. And this was pre-pandemic, where 27% of all charter school students in that state attend online or virtual charter schools. And so the question is, what produced these differences and how we can understand them? So in Michigan, when we focus in on the institutions, what we see is that it's a very lax regulatory environment. There are multiple agencies that can authorize new charter schools, and these can really be any state body. So it can be something as small as a community college. And what this has done is shape the market so that there's a lot of power on the side of the charter schools, because charter schools, if they get turned down by one authorizer, they can just go to another one. And this has led to a process called authorizer shopping, where charter schools will go from one authorizer to another until they find one that will accept them. And what's key about this is authorizers are actually incentivized to charter schools because they get a little cut of the money of each charter school that operates. And so you end up with situations where a tiny community college in the far northern part of Michigan is actually authorizing a bunch of charter schools in Detroit with no connection to that community. And another key aspect of this market is that, unlike most other states, for-profit organizations can run and operate charter schools. And what's important here is that this system was a result of a strong belief in the efficiency of unregulated markets, with the governor who put in place this charter school system, John Engler, saying, "We were always motivated by the idea that competition is important, and we believe that much could be done with competition within the public system itself. And so this was really the guiding principle of Engler, who read Milton Friedman in his spare time and really designed this system to fit Friedman's view of how markets should operate. What's crucial is that within Michigan, this common system has had a highly uneven rollout. So this chart maps out percentage enrollment in charter schools alongside the Black population of Michigan cities. And what you'll see here is almost a perfect correlation where market policies have had the most effect on majority Black school districts in the state. And what we need to think about is how the institutions and contestations have created this uneven geography of markets within Michigan. And what's important to understand is that majority Black school districts in Michigan have this rollout of markets has largely been put in place under conditions of emergency management, where the state directly took over school districts with the explicit goal of creating marketplaces. So you had an emergency manager of the Detroit Public School District coming in saying to the Wall Street Journal, I believe it was, like, we're here to create a market of schools. And so when this chart was made, 82% of schools under emergency management, or of students in schools under emergency management, were Black, and only 3% were white. And so there was a highly uneven racial logic in who was placed under emergency management and who felt the extremes of the rollout of these market systems. By contrast, whenever similar market-making policies as used in places like Detroit were attempted to be spread in majority white school districts, and this includes the Detroit suburbs, they were stopped by community dissent. So there was a lot of contestation of the rollout of similar policies. And as one parental activist put it, there was a clear racial logic here where people would say, a lot of people think, oh, charters are fine for those poor people in Detroit. They need options, but what do you mean they're going to take away our high school? So thinking about these two things together, the creation of the particular market institutions that we saw in Michigan were shaped by a strong ideological belief in the efficiency of markets, but its actual rollout in different parts of the state has to be understood in what type of contestations were enabled alongside geographies of race and power. And so here we see both the effects of ideology in shaping market forms, but also the importance of thinking about uneven geographies in how those forms are instituted across space. By contrast, in Oregon, we see a strong system of regulation of charter schools as based in the really strong power of the teachers union in Oregon. So unlike in Michigan, here there's only one organization that can act as an authorizer of new schools, and that's the local school district, who says which schools can or cannot open within their boundaries. And this has led to a very different market dynamic with a high barrier to entry. And so rather than this extreme market vision we see in Michigan, charter schools have been more tightly regulated, and there's been a focus on school districts and charter schools working a bit more together than this all-out competition. And this was a so-called middle ground approach that was lauded in local newspapers at the time this charter school law was put in place in Oregon. Nevertheless, it's not to say that markets are stable entities, and this was what stayed in place in Oregon as time went on. A key dynamic that changed the situation has been the increased popularity of virtual charter schools in that state, which you'll remember educate almost 27% of the students who attend charters in Oregon. And what's important to understand here is that these schools actually devised a clever strategy to bypass the system of regulation that was put in place over charter schools in Oregon. What they decided to do is open in these really tiny rural school districts and then operate statewide. So they could get approval by a school district of a few hundred students and then start advertising their services in a city like Portland. So they really put this market system of regulation to the test. And as described by a member of Oregon State Board of Education, they just got it by doing it. They didn't ask for permission. They had 2,000 students attending their school before anyone even noticed. And then they seized the ground in order to challenge this market system of regulation. And so what we see here is that despite the stronger institutional framework in place in Oregon, contestation of market structures isn't always a contestation of damaging market forms of regulation. It can also be profit-seeking firms or others who are trying to create a more lax regulatory market, probing for opportunities to disrupt market systems in ways that can maximize their profits. And I think this is an interesting counter to how we think about often struggle within markets as.
So you have 3 minutes.
Perfect. I'm round in the corner. And so some key takeaways that I want to end with is that both cases highlight how struggles over charter school markets articulate with the politics of the schooling sector and the geographies with which they are embedded. So in Oregon, the strength of the teachers union meant a different sort of market than in Michigan. And so without understanding the politics of these particular places, we can't understand why charter school markets function in ways that they do, or the sources of these kind of local variations or divergences. Nevertheless, we also have to pay attention to the connections between these local experiences and wider circuits of power. So between systems of regulation and the big philanthropists who have been funding charter schools across the US, or the for-profit actors in Oregon who are probing market forms for the ways to unleash their profits. And so what my chapter tries to argue is that we need an understanding of the relationship between the circuits of power that mobilize and maintain market forms and the place-based politics with which these markets become articulated. And this requires a methodological sensitivity to both the situated politics of markets and their connections to wider geographies of power, and as Christian mentioned, to the different types of social difference within which markets are networked or embedded, or however we want to think about their institutions. And so we need an attentiveness to how localized political contestation may result in new market forms, or conversely, how such contestation may be overcome by different circuits of power, such as large corporate actors or philanthropists with a market agenda. So that's me, and I'll pass it along.
Thanks, Dan. And now we will turn to Philip Ashton.
Great. I have a single slide just so that you don't have to watch me speak. And I want to thank the editors for the opportunity to present here. I also want to say hello to a couple of friends in the audience. Nice to see you all, at least virtually. Oops. Let me do that again. This is a paper co-authored, a chapter co-authored with Brett Christophers. And it's titled From the Urbanization of Capital to the Capitalization of the Urban. And our paper takes off from some ideas about market and space put forward by David Harvey, particularly in his notion of the urbanization of capital. Among Harvey's many contributions to geographical political economy, he had the idea that political economists shouldn't dismiss exchange relations as the preserve of mainstream economics. And he argued that exchange should be treated as dialectically intertwined with what Marx called the hidden abode of production. Now, for economic geographers and for political economists, this dynamic is at the heart of Harvey's ideas about the urbanization of capital. This notion references the historical and geographical processes by which the circulation of capital expands through the physical space of the built environment and the spatial configuration of urban regions. There are two aspects to the relationship between urban space and capitalist markets that we think are at the heart of Harvey's concept. The first is the role of dense new urban geographies of the industrial city in facilitating the mass production and mass market-oriented economy of factory-based industrialism. So in the words of the labor historian Mark Starr, writing a century ago, machinofacture would never have commenced if there had not been the need of supplying a world market, cities forming both the engine for mass production, as well as the intermediate and final markets for those products. The second aspect of the relationship between capitalist markets and urban space corresponds to the post-war era in the West. And this phase involved increasing conditions of overaccumulation, wherein capitalists struggle to find profitable opportunities to reinvest, typically because of overproduction relative to insufficient consumer demand. So in this example, the physical space of the post-war or eventually the post-industrial city soaks up the surpluses resulting from that expansion once it nears limits imposed by declining profitability. And it does so through suburbanization or other spatial fixes. Within this twofold relationship between capitalist markets and urban space, urban physical space fulfills a kind of thermostat function in relation to wider capitalist market development. Whereas formerly, the production of the built environment generated the steam to power market expansion of the expansion of capitalism, today it increasingly enables market-constrained capitalism to let off steam by providing alternative circuits for investment. Now, Harvey's account of the urbanization of capital, highlighting the expansionary and the absorptive qualities of markets relative to the production of surplus value, has been highly influential in urban political economy and economic geography. However, for interpreters of the post-1970s era of financialization and its relationship to cities, and I'll put Berndt and myself in this camp, this account produces an odd set of blinders. One set of blinders has to do with the relatively simple approach to time that underlies the role of markets and market development in the circulation of capital. In many accounts of the urbanization of capital, production and absorption or exchange are separated by calendar time. The circuit of M prime is implicitly portrayed as a temporally sequential process. Markets are pre-existing production in time as a condition for the transformation of money into commodities. And then they re-enter into the picture after production as a means of securing the accumulation of capital. But as capitalist money comes to embrace the temporal gaps within that sequential process in the form of finance or credit, it becomes easier to situate investments in the built environment or in exchange more broadly as divorced from some underlying reality of the moment of surplus value production. This is especially manifest in proliferating accounts of the speculative or fictitious nature of urban investment, or of what has broadly come to be known as the financialization of the city. Rather than seeing the futurity of investment and exchange as productive forces here, shaping value as a regulatory norm, the landscape that becomes produced by markets within the urbanization of capital thereby becomes quite unreal. Now, the approach that we develop in this chapter seeks to remedy this unreality by paying closer attention to the instrumentation of urban markets. And as is referenced through the title, we do so by developing this idea of capitalization and the capitalization of the urban. Authors such as Nitzan and Bichler in their book Capitalist Power describe capitalization as the discounting into present value of future earnings. In this, it's a core calculative logic of capitalism and its drive to commensuration. It's key to the process whereby earning potential is integrated into the numerical architecture of capital. At the same time, we think of capitalization as something more than just a background calculative practice. It's also a political process of ordering with both spatial and temporal dimensions. And here we take our cue from Timothy Mitchell, who develops the idea of capitalization as depending on the ability to control politically that future, or at least be able to promise to investors that you can. So this makes capitalization more than just the abstract figuration of the future as described by textbook accounts of the time value of money. In Mitchell's framing, it's also necessarily a process of the control of territory that is a very specific set of spatial and temporal technologies actively working to secure revenue and make it durable. So through the chapter, we developed this idea of the capitalization of the urban through exploration of 4 contemporary examples of market making. So if Erica started us out in the feudal era, we sort of bring it into millennial capitalism in the 21st century. 2 of our examples are somewhat established market circuits, the first being the private market for urban infrastructure, assets and investments, and the second being investments in green building retrofits and technologies. And 2 of our examples are emergent, the first being payment systems organized around prepaid debit cards, but also other private forms of the circulation of the means of payment. And the second being ride sharing services like Uber and Lyft. Now, our exploration is essentially speculative. We draw on extant research, in many cases by friends or fellow travelers, such as Sarah Newth and Mark Keir, as well as our earlier work on some of these topics. But through these examples and these sort of market vignettes, as we call them, we're concerned with highlighting 2 specific parameters of capitalization. The first is the degree to which contemporary market making is instrumented through the very materiality of the city and its varied flows, and that forms the basis for new kinds of market developments. In examples such as urban infrastructure and green building technologies, market making depends on the structuring and sequencing of urban flows by earlier rounds of the urbanization of capital. So Sarah Newth's work on economies of repair and commercial real estate highlights how investments are valorized not only by the upside revenue potential of capturing energy flows from older commercial buildings, but also by doing so in an urban landscape where climate change threatens rising energy costs and increasing volatility in energy supplies. Similarly, Mark Keir's work on prepaid debit cards shows us how seeing cities as dense structures of payment flows opens a window into new market circuits focused on privatizing the means of payment. So the second parameter of capitalization that we focus on in the chapter is the institutionalization of technologies of capture as the basis for creating the durability of revenue structures that Mitchell references. Many of these technologies take legal form, like their contracts, the permissive administrative regulations, or market barriers that enhance returns to market makers. In this, capture takes forms that we might classically know of as rent. However, our vignettes also highlight how technologies of capture can take other forms. So to return to Mark Keir's work on prepaid debit cards as one example, it's the broader instrumentation of credit risk and its role in creating hierarchies of credit access that becomes a conditional possibility for the capitalization of fee income from prepaid debit cards. Indeed, it's the structuration of credit market access around risk through the credit score as well as through broader financial restructuring that in turn reinforces market arrangements where consumers must in fact pay for the means to pay for goods and services necessary for their livelihood. Now, the question you might be asking, what are the stakes in reworking the urbanization of capital into the capitalization of the urban? We offer this account, as I think I indicated earlier in my talk, as a kind of curative to the often truncated notions of speculation and fictitious capital that have emerged at the center of many accounts of the financialization of the city. Capitalization in our account is more than just the anticipation of the realization of future fictitious values. Instead, it is simultaneously a set of power relationships organized through mechanisms of capture and structures of control, which capture and control is a necessary condition for the conversion of income into tradable financial assets. To borrow from Ivan Asher's formulation, capitalization offers a way of seeing capital's relation to its own future, and hence everyone's relation to the future somewhat differently. At the same time, capitalization of the urban opens up new horizons for the study of the intertwining of markets and space. Rather than seeing markets as somehow superimposed on top of the fabric of the city, capitalization examines how the urban has become, in Mitchell's framing, a commodity itself. That is, a nexus of opportunities for the capture of material flows of people, of energy, of payments, of data, or of a number of other urban flows. So in examples like payment systems, ride-hailed services like Uber and Lyft, green building retrofits, these all reference complex configurations of market and space. They harness spare physical assets and laboring time to fashion new markets out of cross-cutting flows of urban energy and people. And in this, we think they are operating at the very frontiers of contemporary capitalist urbanization. So thanks.
Thanks, Phil. It's such an awkward kind of space in which I think, oh, sorry, I'm supposed to turn on my video. Okay. We would normally applaud for all the speakers. And so I just want to thank you for that. Yeah, we could all turn our cameras on now, actually. And I want to thank all the speakers because they're really rich presentations on the socio-spatial and temporal constitution of markets and their varied, diverse, uneven forms, and also illustrating the very contested and power-laden nature of market creation processes, really presenting us with a dynamic view of the institutionalization process. Oh, is my video not on? I'm getting messages to turn on my video. Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. So with that, I would like to open the floor for questions. And we do have one question with the Q&A. And in total, we have 15 minutes for question and answer discussion. So the question that we have is from Alan Paul, and it's directed at Erica. Erica, can you comment on Henry Perrine's work on medieval cities, in particular his thesis that cities were chartered specifically to create a space outside the feudal system in which merchants could legally operate?
Yeah, good old Perrine. First of all, the whole thing that I'm trying to say is that cities aren't created outside the feudal system for merchants to legally operate. And actually, once you get merchants in there, they're very closely regulated, and tolls and fines and specific instructions about who can do what and where they can do it are in place for domestic and for international traders. And then, he has a long thing about long distance trade and shifting of trade from the Mediterranean to the north. And so my recollection of Perrine now is a little bit hazy. It's been a while. But I do think that he does not really talk about some of the particularities of this long distance trade. And one of them is that the people who carried it out were not necessarily merchants. They were often agents of ruling class people who were going to try and get silks and spices, and that's my dog, and all the usual things that rich people want. And also, he doesn't talk about the return trade. What is it that the Western Europeans are exporting to the Middle East to get all of these spices and gold and things like that? And the answer to that is principally slaves. So I think our collective picture of the Middle Ages doesn't include a very lively slave trade. And the the continuation of slavery in England, at least until the 12th century. So, so once you really start looking at the trade connections, both internally and externally, it seems to me that the real characteristics of this are quite different from what he suggested.
Thanks, Erica. We have a question from an anonymous attendee. Wonderful panel. I'm wondering how the book and its contributors consider the tension between the concrete historical variability of actually existing markets, as Jamie put it, on the one hand, with the view of the market as a generalized historical instrument of class domination. So anybody like to address that?
I'll say something if no one else is going to say anything. I think that tension of the challenges of moving away from tacit or implicit market universalism, however it's defined, is really the question that informs so much of the projects in the book, which are, in many respects, I think, finding their own way to grapple with and analyze the actually existing diversity of markets and to trace the sources and causes of that diversity. And there's some chapters in the start of the book that essentially grapple with this notion of various notions of the universal market as a sort of overbearing abstraction. And it's often, I think, the reaction to that abstraction, especially in heterodox and critical scholarship, is to render the market a sort of no-go area. And heterodox and critical scholars study anything but markets as a result of sort of not wanting to get tangled up in those problematics. So I think one of the things that's very encouraging about the substantive inquiries in the book is how they sort of venture onto the terrain of the market, really having thrown off a lot of that baggage of market universalism, however it's defined.
Sorry, Dan, did you?
Yeah, I think this is actually one of the kind of central tensions and central questions about that I struggle with and that I'm trying to think through. Our co-panelist who Phil presented, the half of Phil who's not here of that presentation, Brett, has a wonderful article called From Marx to the Market, which I think really struggles with this tension. And in many ways, I think alongside that is this variability has to be understood within all the power that often gets used to kind of push back against variable forms of market, which might disrupt the way it's used, as you put it, a historical instrument of class domination. And so part of what I was trying to get at with my presentation is the ways that we can't just understand this variability of actually existing markets without also understanding the circuits of power, the forces, the mechanisms that are often used to push back against variability, which might disrupt opportunities to make profit or to put in place systems of class domination, as the anonymous attendee puts it. So I think it's a real tension, but I think it's a productive one to think through, to think about, what are the, as Brett Christopher puts it, what are the limits on this variability? And rather than taking it for granted that these limits are put in place, looking at the actual mechanisms through which markets become contested sites where these dynamics are played out. So that's kind of what I'm struggling with in my work, and what how I try to approach that question. Hopefully that made sense.
Maybe I can also add something, because it's not a question which I would normally be easy to answer, but I would think that for me, market gets its power precisely because it's so flexible and variegated. It's exactly what is at stake. That is what interests me. I would like to think that it's not always succeeding, but it's exactly the variation that makes it so successful.
Anyone else like to add? Thanks. Mark? Oh, you need to unmute. Oh.
Yeah. Well, I would just add, I would add to that idea that it's the variability of class domination and racialized capitalism as well, which needs to be put into the domain of thinking about variation, and for all its limitations, you would just have to think of the work of Piketty, for example, in terms of the nature of inequality in the Belle Epoque to the nature of equality in current social formations, and the huge variation across contemporary economies, from market socialism all the way through to the United States and Europe and so on. So I think an instituted conception of the economy, which is variable in space and time, has to go all the way through, and that would apply to the nature of inequality and unequal power circuits in the way that Dan was talking about, the way that capital is formed, in the way that Phil was talking about, and so on. So yeah, it's that's why a comparative and historical approach to that issue is, I think, absolutely key.
Thanks, Mark. Anyone else wanted to? Okay, do we have any other questions from the attendees or from
Norma?
panels? Yeah.
Can I say something? You're very good at running the session, but also you should say what you think about that question, I think.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess maybe building a little bit off of what Christian said, I feel, and others, I guess, who have already said, I feel like it's the way in which the market touches down that enables the market to circulate and to be actualized. So it's really in the concrete that that we can, to view the market as a dynamic rather than, I mean, I think part of the risk of seeing the market as hegemonic or uniform is it also presents it as somewhat static and universal, not just spatially, but in time. And I think what sometimes is presented as the frictions that underpin kind of market dynamism is, is that spatiality, right? That diverse construction. So, yeah, I mean, we're speaking in really abstract terms, I guess, but I feel like it's what each of these studies, the concrete studies, brings to the analysis, right? So yeah, I don't think I have any more to contribute, I guess, than that. I don't know if anyone else.
One thing, if we still have time.
Sure.
Which is that, as you can see, I like comparative historical stuff. But I also think that what I bring to it, because I just read a lot of other people's stuff and I'm a synthesizer, not an archivist. But what I bring to it that the historians don't is a geographical sensibility, right? So I am impelled to ask questions that they don't ask, like how do you manage resources across territory? And I think that we should really keep in mind that that's our kind of superpower, and insist that this is also critical to understanding how instantiated institutional markets work.
I would just add also that I think it's very important to also include not just market economic power, but state economic power. And it's just to witness what's happened in the UK just these last couple of days, when the Prime Minister is texting a billionaire offshore capital in Singapore, saying that they can fix the tax rules that will apply to them. And you have a series of texts going on between them. And it's an exercise of certainly somebody with a huge amount of market economic power, but only in conjunction with state economic power and the capacity to fix deals that are not just market deals; they are state market deals, and you need. I mean, in a way, it goes all the way back to Erica's story. You can't understand these markets without understanding the other forms of economic power that can be wielded by, in this case, the state.
Well,
and the inequalities that arise from that.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, and actually, part of the thing that I'm trying to construct is an explanation of how states and markets grow up together and it can't be otherwise. But I did want to say, Mark, that if you're competing for the title of most corrupt state on earth, I think that I have you beat. And I just think you should walk away from that.
We are unfortunately coming to the end of our panel discussion or roundtable discussion. And I just wanted to note that the anonymous, the attendee who was labeled as anonymous attendee is actually Aman Banerjee. So thank you, Aman. And I also just wanted to take this opportunity to say, I hope that this roundtable discussion might entice you to consider buying this book with the beautiful cover and checking out some of the other chapters and checking out in more depth the contributions that each of these panelists make in really helping us to ground our both conception and to actually spatially ground the market. Okay, any other very final points from anyone else before we wrap up? Because we are, okay, so thanks everyone for joining. Thank you to the attendees and to the panelists and to the co-editors for co-organizing this.
Bye-bye. Yeah, nice. Thanks for sharing it in such a nice way, Norma.
Oh no, thank you. It's again such an awkward kind of space, but it's still nice to be in
rigid some way. Yeah.
with you all. And thanks.